Good evening, everyone. My name is Douglas Sprang, and I lead the Energy and Environment Series for the MIT Club of Northern California. Tonight's event on negative emissions is the second in a series of events during our 2021-22 season, featuring top speakers in the field. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Roger Ains, Chief Climate Scientist at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, who has been researching this subject for many years. We have enabled live Q&A, and I'll do my best to get as many of these questions to our moderator as I can, although past experience suggests we won't get to all of them. We will also answer many of the questions we got from online registration. I'll be back at the end of the program to announce our next event of the season, but now I would like to introduce Larry Kelly, a longtime contributor to the MIT Club's Energy and Environment Series and an experienced investor in the field, who will orchestrate tonight's program. Take it away, Larry.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Larry Kelly, and I will be your moderator tonight. Currently, over 36 billion tons of carbon are emitted each year into the environment. This carbon remains in the atmosphere and the oceans for a very long time. Even if emissions were stopped, this carbon already emitted continues to heat the planet and contribute to climate change. How can this carbon be removed from the atmosphere? This event tonight is our first talk in our new negative emissions series, and there will be several more coming. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, a longtime leader in the field, Dr. Roger Ains, the Chief Scientist in the Energy and Homeland Security Program at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. Roger also leads the Carbon Initiative at Livermore, which aims to understand, develop, and implement technologies for the removal of carbon from the atmosphere. This is also known as negative emissions technology. Roger has been at LLNL since 1984, more than 35 years. During this time, he has worked on nuclear waste disposal, on environmental remediation, on application of stochastic methods to inversion and data fusion, on management of carbon emissions, including separation technology, and on monitoring and verification methods for sequestration. Roger has written 2 books, including one with his wife, Amy, the title of which is Championing Science, Communicating Your Ideas to Decision Makers. You know, all of us who are technical, myself included, could benefit from this one. Roger has over 100 publications. He says he's lost count, and he has 16 patents to his name. Roger has a BS in chemistry from Carleton College in Minnesota and a PhD in geochemistry from Caltech, that well-known West Coast technology school. Roger, can you tell us a bit about yourself? Where did you grow up, and what were significant influences on you?
Thanks, Larry. I grew up on a farm in Ohio, and that taught me some important things. It taught me that time matters. You can't go out and pull on the corn and have it come up faster. You need to plan ahead. And it taught me a love of nature that I still have today.
What caused you to go into a technical field? What led to the light bulb going off?
You mean from my farm background?
Well, yeah.
Farm in my family is a little bit of a euphemism. My family for a long time back were in horticulture. And so I'm actually the 3rd PhD in my family, 3rd generation. My son now has a PhD as well. So we're one of those families. But so, the science around nature was always very much part of our family.
And what was Carleton College like? How did it contribute to your career path?
I went to Carleton intending to get an MD PhD. The school was very well known for having a very strong science program, but also being a small liberal arts school, which I appreciated. I wanted a school where I get some breadth, but also where I could go in and talk to the provost if I needed to, and you could there. And so
That was an MD
yes.
in medical field. What were you
Well,
thinking about there?
Well, I mean, I would have finished an undergraduate degree there and gone to medical school.
Yeah.
But my intent was to go into medical research. But I made a mistake. I took a geology course from a truly gifted teacher. And then I took another one. And then I took another one. And I ended up finishing my degree in chemistry, but then figuring I really love geology. I'm going to go into that. So that's what I did at Caltech.
The hook was set.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and then Caltech, you know, everyone at MIT wishes that MIT had Pasadena's weather. Yeah. And by the way, you know, this is Nobel Prize week, and congratulations go out to Caltech, as on Monday, Caltech alum Artem Papapudian was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine for the discovery of receptors for temperature and touch. And this is Caltech's 46th Nobel. Pretty good, huh?
Indeed.
Yeah, speaking of Nobels, on Tuesday, the physics prize was awarded to three scientists, Syukuro Manabe, Klaus Hasselmann, and Giorgio Parisi, for their work on climate change. All three scientists were recognized for their work on modeling the consequence of variable action in complex physical systems, such as the effect of CO2 emissions on global temperature. Now, this is the first Nobel that's ever been given out for climate change, other than the one that went to the IPCC, right?
Yeah, the one that really for truly developing the science needed to understand climate change.
Yeah, that's great. So this area is starting to come into its own, you know, when it gets recognized at the Nobel level.
Yes.
So what was Caltech like, and how did that influence your career?
Well, one of the most interesting things about Caltech is that the professors compete for students there. So I actually ended up working for the third faculty member who was on my list of three who I thought I could work for. And so it's a very, you get a lot of close interactions with faculty, you know, Nobel Prize winners or not. It's a very enjoyable environment if you're willing to face up to people who are pretty opinionated. And when I got to Lawrence Livermore, there was a big push to make the place friendlier and nicer. And I went, what do you mean? It's pretty nice here.
Yeah. I think the ratio is 3-to-1, 3 students for every faculty member. That's so exceptional. It would seem like you would have all kinds of access to anybody you wanted to at any time.
You absolutely did.
Yeah. And then Lawrence Livermore, can you tell us a little bit about the Carbon Initiative and the Energy and Homeland Security Program at the lab? What is the primary mission, and what are the major areas of research?
Well, we've had a big energy program forever. Energy has always been an important part of our work, although of course, you know, our main work at the lab is nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
But
it is part of the Department of Energy. So.
Yes. But we have about 150 people who work on energy at the lab, which is a huge energy program, even though it's a blip on the size of our lab with 8,000 people. But about 5 years ago, we started looking at these IPCC models that were coming out and went, whoa, this is a big problem, this negative emissions thing. It looks like we're going to need some new technology and a lot of new work. In fact, I remember saying to the director, this is impossible, we better start now. And he agreed. So during the Trump administration, he started investing heavily in developing the science of negative emissions. And the funny thing was that so did the rest of the government. During the Trump administration, I hired 35 new people.
Wow, that's good. Yeah, that's fabulous. Yeah. So your current research is on negative emissions, which you're going to talk about tonight. What are some of the greatest challenges that you've encountered, other than getting budgets approved? So, you know, and at what stage of understanding are we? You know, and to borrow a phrase from Don Rumsfeld, where are we in terms of known knowns and known unknowns and unknown unknowns? I mean, where are we? I mean, what do we know, and what are we afraid of? What might come up?
Well, let me quantify those unknown unknowns first. No, I'm kidding. Uh,
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we've really come to grips with in the known knowns is that we now have a pretty good grip on how the climate system works, what the major levers are, and how things are going to turn out given various scenarios. And the known unknowns is, how do those scenarios change? What are we going to do? How are people going to react? How can we drive the investment that's needed to do these things? What are the timing involved in all these things? There's an enormous amount of optimism that is not tied to time frame. And the real things that worry me in the long run are, what are the feedbacks going to be in all these systems? One feedback we know is that we've been stuffing carbon into the ocean. It's going to come back out if we lower the amount in the atmosphere. There will be other things like that we really don't know yet, but that doesn't mean that shouldn't stop us. We need to move forward.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. And one last question before your presentation. What is your guiding principle?
We have about 75 people working on negative emissions at the laboratory. And we often get into a discussion of, should we do a project? Should we take on a new client? Should we work on something? And the deciding factor always is it going to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? Are we going to get tons? How fast are we going to get tons? How fast can we get 1 million tons? We don't have our 1 million tons yet, but that's our goal, is to make it fast, because the climate is not waiting for us. We have to speed it up.
Yeah, great. Good introduction, Roger. Let me turn it over to you now.
All right. Well, thank you. Let me share my screen, which, as we all know, is the most tedious part of any of these processes. Okay. Here's the planet we're trying to save. So let me start off with a little bit of discussion of perspectives, because it's very important. We see things from different views, and I want to show you how I look at this problem. And I'm going to start with some graphs. I can do that with the MIT Club, right?
Sure, absolutely.
This is the
second nature.
These are the carbon emissions that we would expect to get in a kind of a run-of-the-mill business as usual scenario. And obviously one of those things we were talking about at different scenarios, these lines look different, but this is the one that frankly I would expect to happen if we didn't take additional action beyond today. And we all know what the outcome of that's going to be. It's going to be devastating results for climate and temperature. We've talked a lot about getting to 2 degrees C, and the models can tell us what kind of carbon levels we need, emissions levels we need, if we want to get to 2 degrees C. And this is the graph that first launched the Carbon Initiative at Livermore. Is we're going to get to 2 degrees C, we not only have to get to 0, we have to get below 0, because we've already put too much in the air. Now let's start breaking this down. How are we going to get to that red line? If the red line is our goal, that's going to keep us at 2 degrees C. 1.5 degrees C is even harder. I don't even talk about 1.5 degrees C, it's so hard. Let's stick to 2 degrees C, because I can tell you how to get there. There's a whole bunch of technologies that we can use here in brown to reduce our emissions. This is basically getting rid of almost all fossil fuels, electrifying everything, removing as many of the emissions that we currently have that cause greenhouse gases to be in the atmosphere. But it doesn't go all the way down to the red line. Why is that? Well, there's some stuff that we just can't get rid of. And some of this is continued emissions, and some of this is the history that the red line is simply not steep enough. And there are people who would tell you, well, we should just turn off everything. We should stop eating meat. We should stop using fossil fuels tomorrow. Well, that's not going to happen. So we're going to have to deal with those continued emissions. But other things that we care about on there are the fact that there's other greenhouse gases. I'll talk about those in a moment. And there's some CO2 that is just going to either be too hard or too slow to get rid of, and those emissions will continue, and we're going to have to make up for those. Well, how are we going to make up for those? Well, we'll talk about that. That's negative emissions. Some of them are Airplanes, that's a good example of something that is probably going to be too slow. We may get to the point where we run our airplanes on hydrogen, but for the moment, they're going to continue emitting carbon. Agriculture is an insidious one. It's not the emissions from the fuel in the tractor. It's not even the emissions from making the fertilizer, which is a big part of our global emissions. It's the fertilizer itself that's emitting nitrous oxide that is equivalent to 5% of global warming. Are we going to live without fertilizer? I don't think so. That's a major problem. And we're going to have to make up for that warming somehow, probably with negative emissions. And of course, we all know the cattle problem. There are plenty of people who will say, we should just stop eating meat, but I don't include that in my feasible climate futures. We're just going to have to make up for these. And it's simple math. We're just going to have to add negative emissions to the graph. And the green area is what the models tell us today, approximately, we're going to need in order to hit the 2 degrees C climate future. Now, that's all depends on, there's a lot of known unknowns, unknown unknowns in that. But these are approximately what we're going to need. And they're so gigantic that we might as well just accept them as factual because we can't actually do them today anyway. In 2050, we'd have to be removing 10 billion tons of carbon from the atmosphere per year, carbon dioxide. I always talk in terms of tons of carbon dioxide, by the way. At the end of the century, we'd have to be removing 20 billion tons. Just for scale, today, the oil industry produces about 5 billion tons of oil per year. So what this tells us is by the middle of the century, 2050, we have to create a new industry that is twice the size of today's oil industry. We have roughly 25 years to do it in. This is what launched the Carbon Initiative at my lab, obviously a major national lab worthy endeavor. And we like to think globally. That graph I just showed you was global. That's an example of something I call hand of God solution. But God's been remarkably reluctant to come down and hand us these solutions. But academics are really fond of these. Boy, they're like, if we only had a carbon tax, it would have this global impact. And you know, carbon tax is the favorite of economists because it's fair. But not much has happened in that regard, has it? The next category is where the action really is in business. Businesses now recognize that they need to have a goal of net zero if they want to be seen as climate-friendly businesses. And more than 1,000 global businesses have now announced net zero goals, including 2 that I'll talk a little bit about, Microsoft and Shell. And a really important part of those goals is that not only do you have to deal with your own emissions, but you have to deal with what's called your scope 3 emissions, the emissions from the use of your product and the rest of your supply chain, basically the things that you can't control that aren't under your roof. For Microsoft, that's an interesting problem. They need about 6 million tons of negative emissions by the middle of the century. Actually, by 2030 is their goal. And that 6 million tons is almost all composed of the emissions from the electricity that you and I are emitting right now using their product. They have to count that. They can't control how we do that. So they're intending to use negative emissions to make up for that. Shell is a little different problem. Shell's the conventional putting gasoline in your car and then emitting it. And Shell would like to also use negative emissions to make up for some significant amount of that. But while Microsoft needs 6 million tons, Shell would need hundreds of millions of tons. So obviously the first thing they have to do, if we're going to be rational about this, is to figure out alternatives to emitting that carbon dioxide to begin with. And the thing that I won't talk about in this talk, but is important, is that this leads to policies that are more focused than global policies, sector-wide policies, transportation policies, industrial policies, electricity policies that have been remarkably effective here in California. And California is one of the places that has thought very carefully about how to get to zero. There's a good plan. They've looked at all the numbers. They've looked at all the possibilities, looked at how much it's going to cost to get to those plans. And the answer is the brown line. And the brown line doesn't get to zero. Basically, with every tool in the toolbox, California finds the same thing that we saw on the global scale. It's going to come up short. And the state is currently in the process of developing a new plan that it will deal with that. And the new plan, basically the same thing that I talked about globally. We're going to have negative emissions in California if we want to hit zero. Now, this is an incredibly divisive topic in California today, because there are still many people, many of them known academics, who will say, why don't we just go with all renewables tomorrow? And I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think the state thinks it's going to happen. The unions don't think it's going to happen. And so I think that the idea that we're going to need these negative emissions is real. And the good news is it's a very tractable way to solve the problem. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of this talk walking through the answer for how we hit these targets for California, because we've actually gone through the details and we know exactly what it's going to take, or what we think it's going to take at this point. Donald Rumsfeld aside. Let's look at the major ways to do this. What are the major things that I think of as feasible negative emissions technologies? First, always first, natural solutions. These are great. They're inexpensive. They have all kinds of additional benefits. We always want to do these first, and as much of them as we can. Biomass solutions. This is probably a new topic to you, and it basically involves storing the carbon that plants are already putting it into out of the air, storing it permanently. And direct air capture, which is a technological solution that I'm sure many of you have already heard of. And I'll walk through each of these, tell you a little bit about how it works and what I think the issues are with it to deal with. First, trees and soil. These redwood trees are about 40 years old. They're just beginning to hit their stride. That's when trees really start removing a lot of carbon from the atmosphere. They get big enough to actually have a big impact. So first thing about trees is they're kind of a promissory note. If you plant them, it's going to be a while before they're really removing a lot. Good news about redwoods is that they'll continue removing carbon for their entire lifetime, and that amount will increase every year. Every time the tree gets bigger, it removes more carbon. So this is good. We want to keep our forests. We want to keep our old forests, and we want to plant as many of them as we can. But you have to ask the question, are they enough? And I'm going to talk about a few details here. These words are words that you're going to see when you talk about negative emissions, and they have important meanings that I can't begin to drill into tonight. But I'm going to give you a sense of what some of the challenges are with these kinds of solutions, particularly in assuring that they're real and that we can account for them. And durability is the first thing I want to talk about. There's a lot of things that will affect the durability of a forest, but boy, in California, we see that fire is foremost among those. In 2020, we emitted 106 million tons of carbon dioxide from the forest fires that year. That was a bad year, but it doesn't look like it's an unusual year for the future. That was more than our entire industrial emissions in the state. So obviously, if we want to depend upon forests, we have to keep them from burning. And that's an important part of the durability question. Next question is suitability. Where can we plant forests? Because planting a new forest is by far the best way to assure that the carbon is going to be real, that it's going to remove carbon from the atmosphere. But these grasslands in California that we love, you could plant pine trees here, but they wouldn't grow. They'd die. There's not enough water. And frankly, the big oak trees there, whose roots extend 3 times as far as the canopy, would choke them out. This landscape is already optimized, and you can't assume that you can change it and plant a forest of new pine trees here and have a good outcome. You won't. The good news is this grass and oak forest actually absorbs an enormous amount of carbon and puts it into the soil. Next issue is leakage. This is fundamentally an accounting problem. If you own a forest and you say, I promise not to cut this forest, that's fine, but is someone else going to cut twice as much of their forest because you stopped cutting yours? That's leakage. And that's a real problem. The only real way to deal with that is to reduce the amount of timber that we harvest. But of course, timber harvesting is by no means the biggest way that we cut forests today. Most of it is just cut and burned to do things like raise dairy cattle or grow soybeans in Brazil. So the first and foremost thing we have to do is to stop cutting forests for no reason at all. At least these logs are headed off to build houses. So worldwide, best estimates that come from the Nature Conservancy tell us that we could probably get 3 billion tons of forest-based negative emissions if we keep the forests we have and plant forests in places where they're appropriate. So not cover our agricultural land, not cover our grasslands. We could probably get 3 billion tons, maybe a little more. This number varies depending upon how optimistic you are. It's a big number, but it's by no means the 10 to 20 billion tons that we need. Next thing is soils. Soils have a gigantic capacity, but they're speed limited. Since we started plowing, since that picture with that boy plowing the soil, the world's agricultural soils have lost the equivalent of 487 billion tons of carbon dioxide. The red areas, the areas that we farmed the most intensively, are the ones that have lost the most. And if we could put that all back, if we could, through better agricultural practice, return all that carbon dioxide to the soil tomorrow, we'd be done. We wouldn't have to do anything else. But we can't, because it's too slow. And because we continue to have the bad agricultural practices that lost the carbon dioxide from the soil to begin with. And this is something that we're working hard on at Livermore, because the prize is so gigantic, much bigger than the prize for reforestation, but much harder as well. It turns out that soil doesn't store carbon. Soil is alive. Carbon is always moving in and out of soil. And so the trick is, how do you make more of that in occur and less of the out? Well, maybe what you really want is more of both of them. You want a healthy soil that's carbon rich. And one of the things that has happened in the past is people thought about soil being a static reservoir of carbon. You can just put it there and then you'd be done. No, it's not true. The carbon will oxidize, microbes will eat it. If you don't have healthy plants on top of the soil, the carbon in the soil will be lost. And the deeper the roots are of those plants, the more resilient that carbon is going to be. The great carbon-rich soils of the Central Plains of the US were built by perennial plants that put roots down 3 or 4 meters into the soil. And we're still harvesting the bounty of that. But that's one of the things we have to do, is return to using deeply rooted plants that put carbon deep in the soil, and where we won't lose it if you have a fire or a drought, or worse, if you plow the soil again, which we know is going to happen. Second category I want to talk about is biomass-based solutions. If we grow a lot of carbon, and we use photosynthesis to enhance that, well, it basically is the process, we're not enhancing it. Are there ways that we can take advantage of what Mother Nature has already done to use that biomass to make products like hydrogen? And something the models from the IPCC have always highlighted is the idea of using biomass to make energy. They call this BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And I'll explain a little later in the talk why I hate that term. But for now, let's acknowledge that biomass basically is 50% carbon by weight. It's a terrific place to start. And forest waste is how we got started thinking about it at Livermore. California is currently planning to thin our forests, to return them to the condition that a healthy forest would have, not full of brush in between the big trees, but full of empty space in between the big trees. And in doing that, they're planning on removing 15 million tons of biomass a year. And the question became, what could we do with that? And we immediately said, wow, let's not just burn that. Let's not pile burn it or let it rot in the forest, which is what happens to it today, because then the carbon returns to the atmosphere. What if we could get that carbon underground permanently? And the amount of biomass that we have in these categories in California is amazing. Between the forest waste of the northern part of the state, the agricultural waste of the center part of the state, shown here in yellow, and the trash of the big cities, shown here in blue, green is basically sewage. There's an enormous amount of waste carbon that currently in California we're letting return to the atmosphere. Why? We don't need to do that. What if we converted that biomass and put that carbon dioxide permanently out of the atmosphere? That would amount to 106 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. That's gigantic impact. It's nearly all we need for that target that I showed you for California. But we're going to need technologies to do that. And I'll talk a little bit about what some of those technologies are. But basically, you need to take that biomass, convert it into something else, and put the carbon dioxide permanently out of the atmosphere, either in the form of carbon or more likely in the form of carbon dioxide. And this is why I don't like the idea of BECCS, calling it bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. The energy content of biomass is terrible. We don't run our economy on wood anymore, but the carbon content of biomass is amazing. It's 50% carbon by weight. And so if we have a price on carbon, this graph shows is that the value of that biomass as a carbon source increases as the cost of carbon goes, as the price on carbon goes up. And at very low carbon prices that are basically larger than what we have today in European markets, for instance, and in the California low carbon fuel standard market, which is currently running at about $150 a ton, the carbon value is much larger than the energy value. So that's not to say we should ignore the energy value, but we should make our decisions based upon the carbon value and on getting that carbon underground permanently out of the atmosphere. And that's where the money is in these new businesses. Sure, you're going to make hydrogen, you're going to make aviation fuels, you're going to do things like that. But that's the add-on. The real money is in the carbon. One of the ways that you might not think about are anaerobic digesters, the dairy digesters all up and down the Central Valley, or the sewage plant that's in your hometown. They're currently making methane, and most of that methane is getting used today. Only a little bit of it's getting flared. But they're just venting the carbon dioxide that comes from it. We should be grabbing that carbon dioxide and putting it underground. And if you do that, then you end up with an interesting kind of methane. You end up with methane that's carbon negative. Rather than the fossil methane that we use mostly today, this methane would actually represent a reduction in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That's pretty cool. So let's think about how this might look in an economy of the future. We've all heard about hydrogen as being an important part of the future economy because when we use hydrogen, it doesn't emit any greenhouse gases. And we've talked about making this with electrolysis. And I graphed this as electrolytic hydrogen having zero carbon intensity. The amount of carbon emitted per unit of hydrogen is zero. And we tend to do this in terms of kilograms per kilogram. So let's look at the sources that we have today. If we look at fossil hydrogen, basically we make hydrogen by converting methane, fossil methane, and that emits about 7 kilograms of CO2 for every kilogram of hydrogen that we end up with. That's the conventional process today. That's how almost all the hydrogen in this country is made today, emitting a lot of carbon dioxide. Well, we could capture the carbon dioxide from those existing facilities, and that's starting to be done. The company Airgas in particular is being very aggressive about doing this. They've looked at their business model and said, that doesn't make any sense. We should stop emitting that. And of course, they're going to get good value from putting that carbon dioxide underground. Cuts it down to 3 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. If we built new facilities that were optimized, that were the best we could possibly do for doing this, we could get it down to about 1 kilogram per kilogram. And that's pretty good. That's really, compared to what we're doing today, that's an enormous improvement. But what if we fed those steam methane reformers, that's what SMR stands for. What if we fed those with biogas? Well, if that biogas had the CO2 removed from it and permanently put underground, then suddenly our hydrogen would now have a carbon intensity of -7. We'd be removing 7 kilograms of carbon from the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere for every kilogram of hydrogen that we make. That's the kind of new product that we need to be thinking about. Instead of just reducing carbon, we need to think about products that actually clean up the atmosphere. And this is one that could. We can even do better than that. What if we made hydrogen directly from the biomass, directly from those wood chips that are coming from the clearing operations that are in the forest today? Then the carbon footprint of that hydrogen would be -20. The value of the carbon is actually considerably greater than the value of the hydrogen in making that. And the state has picked up on this. There's a $50 million demonstration item in this year's budget to build a demonstration plant to do this, because they recognize that the net benefits of clearing the forest and then creating a clean fuel like hydrogen while removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, that's the kind of win-win-win that we have to have. And it makes sense. The economics of it all makes sense today. Last technology I want to talk about is direct air capture. This is the sexy, cool machines. These are some machines built by a couple of graduates of ETH in Zurich. They looked at this technology and said, we can do that. And they built a company, Climeworks, that builds these units. And this one's running in Zurich today. They basically remove carbon dioxide from the air and then either reuse it. In this case, this is being reused in those greenhouses in the background, or put it permanently out of the atmosphere, such as putting it underground. And the primary energy that you need to do this is heat. So the Climeworks people have teamed up with the country of Iceland. And they said Iceland has nearly unlimited geothermal resources, plus great rocks to store the CO2 in. And so they just recently opened the largest negative emissions facility in the world. This is called Orca, and it's at one of the Icelandic geothermal plants. They capture the CO2 there using geothermal power and then put it into the rocks, permanently storing it under Iceland. That's the good news. The bad news is it's only 4,000 tons per year. This is the biggest one in the world. There's a lot of ramp up to be done, but it's up, it's running, it's operating, it's expensive. What are we going to do about that expense? And we looked at that at Livermore and said, how can we think about what these costs are going to be in the future? And we used the conventional approach of learning curves. You're all familiar with these. Learning curves basically depend upon the number of units that you build, and the learning is applied basically every time you double the number of units you built. It's assumed that you learn a certain amount. And for these kinds of technologies, we guessed that learning curve was between 10 and 20%. Those are the kinds of curves that you see here. There's two different curves. The green is for the geothermal units that I just showed you that start off very expensive. Guess what? They build these by hand in Zurich. They're expensive, but they're going to get cheap fast because they're small units and you need a lot of them. So you're going to double the units quickly. The brown curve is a second technology, another MIT-derived technology from David Keith, Carbon Engineering. These are big units that run on natural gas and are 1 million tons for each unit. So the learning is slow, but eventually they will be more efficient because the units are bigger and more efficient. Good news on both of these is that we can expect the costs to come down in the vicinity of $100 to $200 a ton from the roughly $500 or even $1,000 a ton today that those cost. So at Livermore, we did a report on all of these things, and we looked at what the state of California could do and estimated what the 2045 costs would be and what the limits are on these things. How much of each of these could we do? Not the pie in the sky, let's do everything. No, but really, what are the limits? How many acres do we have? How many tons of biomass do we have? What can we do? And the result of that study was that we need all three of these options in California, and this result is going to be translated around the world. There's nothing magical about California. We have the world's 5th largest economy, and there's nothing particularly different about our economy than other economies. It's going to look similar to this everywhere. Natural and working lands, these natural solutions, we can get about 25 million tons a year, partly because we've never deforested California, so we can't reforest California. But that's true in a lot of places. That basically you're land limited on your natural solutions, and so you can't have as much as you want. You're stuck with the amount of land that's appropriate. 25 million tons a year, and that's optimistic for all the approaches that would be used. The big hitter that we found was going to be really important is negative emissions from biomass conversion, which is, there's a lot of biomass in California. And if we put that underground, we found 83 million tons could be realistically obtained. We're still short of our 125 million ton goal. We can get the rest of that with machines with direct air capture. It's the most expensive if you use the least of that in your plan as you could. But basically, all of these make sense. They can all be done. But we built a supply curve. We said, what does the cost look like as we develop more and more negative emissions? We start with natural solutions. The average for that is pretty cheap, 11 million tons. Obviously, you're going to do as much of that as you can. Makes a lot of sense. In the middle, all those in orange are the biomass-based solutions. And they're remarkably inexpensive because you make a valuable product. Hydrogen turns out to be the best, but it's not very different if you make aviation fuel or even if you make electricity. Each of those is a little more expensive, but not dramatically more expensive. Point is, you're doing 2 jobs at the same time, and so you get paid twice. You're removing carbon dioxide and you're making a valuable carbon-free fuel. At the end of the curve, you'll see the air capture, which we estimate is going to come in around $200 a ton by the time it's developed enough to be applied in California. And that means there's many, many millions of dollars that have to be spent, in fact, billions of dollars that have to be spent building the initial facilities that have to be done to get that learning curve to where we want it to be, to get those costs down to the $200 that I show here. So this average, about $8 or $9 billion for the negative emissions that California needs at $65 a ton. That's cheap. When we first showed this graph to the state, people in the Air Board and the administration were blown away. That's a lot less than they expected to pay for negative emissions. An important question is, who will pay? And the answer is all of us. This is just like trash removal. We don't throw our trash in the street in Livermore. I doubt you do in your town, wherever you are. We pay someone to take it away, to have the environment that we want to have. Well, that's about $9 billion and about 0.3% of California's GDP today. In the US, we spend about 1% of our GDP hauling our trash away. I believe the number is actually larger in California. It turns out that number is really hard to get. I think the mafia doesn't want to know how much money they're making, want us to know. But the answer is that negative emissions is going to be on a par with taking out the trash. Not surprising, it's the same kind of thing. It's taking out the trash. But where's it going to go? What's the equivalent of the trash dump for this? And the math there is much more harsh than the math for the economics. We need 125 million tons put somewhere, worldwide 10 billion tons. And the natural options are nothing like that. They're not going to come close. So we're going to need durable options for what to do with that CO2. And the answer is it's going to have to go back underground. But there is some good news there. There's a lot of space underground. And when you put CO2 3,000 feet underground, its properties are very similar to oil. It's a liquid. It can be stored in the same rocks that have held oil for millions of years. And the technology and the people and the jobs are the same for both. It's a big deal in a state like California, where we have a lot of jobs that are going to go away in the oil industry. And some of those jobs can be rebuilt into the storage industry. But we don't want to be just Pollyannas about this at Livermore. And we said, okay, where? Exactly where? Where would you do this? Where are these rocks? And so we looked in the oil fields of the state, the same way that you look for your keys underneath the street light at night. We looked where the data is. And these are two areas that are very appropriate for it in the Bakersfield region and then the Delta region here in the Bay Area, where there have been significant oil and gas development. And therefore, there's a lot of data. We can evaluate how much is there. And in green, you see areas that meet all the very strict rules that California has for underground storage, plus our own engineering estimates. Basically, does this make sense? Would somebody invest in those areas? And the good news is there's a lot of them. And in the Bakersfield area, you'll see a lot of red. Why is that? Basically, you can't do it there because it doesn't meet the rules. And the rule there is you can't inject it into something that could be a source of drinking water. And on the east side of Bakersfield, the water comes off the Sierra. It's pretty fresh. You're not allowed to put CO2 into that fresh water, no matter how deep it is, even 3,000 feet deep. In white on the far left-hand side are some fields that we haven't evaluated, and those turn out to be the biggest in California. We don't have a number for you yet on those, but just the colored fields, the ones we evaluated, could store 17 billion tons. In other words, 100 years of the negative emissions that I told you California needs. So the answer is there's a lot of room. It could be as much as 200 billion tons in the Central Valley. We have to figure out how to do it. And the fact that it can do it doesn't answer the most important question that the public asks. Is it safe? I've spent 20 years working on this, and I'll tell you that I think it can be done safely, but now I'll tell you why I think it can be done safely. The first is that geologic storage is done very deep underground. We're looking at the rocks that hold drinking water here, a few hundred feet down. The CO2 will go much, much deeper than that, 3,000 feet down, where it remains a liquid. I can actually say a supercritical liquid to this audience. And I don't usually say that because critical is bad, so supercritical must be really bad, right? But it's a liquid. And at that depth, it basically fills the space in sandstones, very much the way that waves fill the water in sand on the beach. And because California has young rocks, those rocks have not been squashed. That porosity has not been lost. And that's why there's so much porosity in the Central Valley. It held oil, it will hold CO2 as well. And of course, there are many rocks that have the space in them, but didn't have the oil. California requires multiple barriers above this storage level, 2, in fact. And it requires extensive monitoring. It requires barriers underneath it, so that it can't leak out underneath. So the rules are very strict and they're very well thought out. And they've been well thought out because there's been a lot of science money spent on this. The Department of Energy has been looking at this for more than 20 years, and they've done large scale experiments. They've looked at what all the questions are. They looked at the ways to monitor things. They've engaged scientists all over the country. They've engaged the international community. We know a lot about geologic storage today. And the conclusions that we have can be seen in these 2 reports that I would encourage you to look at if you have questions about this. The first, from a European group, looked at all the various places you might store CO2 reasonably, the rational places to put it, and the following the rules that are rational. And what they found is that over 10,000 years, they would expect 98% of that injected CO2 to remain underground. And most of that 2% is what leaks through accidents from wells that they didn't realize were there or that somebody accidentally drilled into the field. Obviously, you can avoid that. But the answer is that reasonably expect this to be long-term. Just like I said, oil has stayed in these rocks tens of thousands of years. We expect the CO2 to remain there as well. And the learning from all of the money that the Department of Energy has invested has been put into a number of best practices manuals. Most important thing here is to note that 14 million tons of CO2 has been put underground in these experimental programs all over the country. And that's a lot of CO2. We've done this at industrial scale. We've examined what the problems are. And the answer is we haven't found any problems that we can't deal with. Bad news here is that we haven't done it in California yet. The California experiment that was supposed to do that had political problems and did not get its CO2 underground, not technical problems. And of course, in California, we have to worry about seismicity, and that's the major issue that we're still investigating here. We believe that can be done safely, but we're not laughing it off. That is the big issue in California and probably anywhere for the safety of CO2 storage, and it continues to be investigated and will be controlled carefully. So my title, will there be enough negative emissions? What are the things that are in our way? What's keeping us from getting there? It's a long road. I said 10 billion tons is twice the size of today's oil industry. How are we going to do that? Well, first, let's look at what's going to stop us. And in between us and success down this long path, there's three demons of our own making we're going to have to cope with. First of these is the demon of timing. People will say, why should we spend money on negative emissions now when we don't need it till 2045? Well, journalist Amy Harder, you may read her from Axios, formerly Axios, now has her own, is a runner. And she says, all these companies that are claiming they're going to have net zero in 2045 are signing up for a marathon. They need to do the training. It's not going to be instant. We have to get ready for it. We have to develop these methods. We have to develop the businesses that are going to make money putting this CO2 underground. You don't move 1 billion tons of anything without businesses that make money doing it. Bigger problem? Me too. This is the Shell problem. If we can put 10 billion tons underground to make up for all these things that we can't stop emitting, why can't we do 11 billion tons and let me continue my business? Why can't Shell make up for selling gasoline by negative emissions? Well, the answer is we're just not going to have enough. Everything I've described to you now is already incredibly hard. And if there are easier ways to stop those emissions, we need to take those. And this is the lesson we've learned in cleaning up our water, that you can't clean up pollution without stopping as much of the pollution as you possibly can at the source. And that's what we have to do here too. We have to stop it at the source. That's always the cheapest way and the fastest way to solve the problem. And finally, this one's insidious: injustice. The things I've described to you are gigantic industrial developments. How are we going to do that without unfairly burdening disadvantaged communities, just like we have in the past? How are we going to build these hydrogen plants all up and down the Central Valley without hurting those communities? Well, there are people who will say we shouldn't do these technical solutions. We should stick with purely the natural solutions. And I would if we could. We've analyzed it carefully. There's just not enough there. We're going to need technical solutions. And so we're going to need to solve the injustice problem while we solve the climate problem. We're going to have to deal with all these things. It's not easy, but this is the big leagues. They throw 100 miles an hour here. You got to do it. But there's a lot of options available. I didn't talk about all of them. But if you want to dig into the detail, I recommend you read Sabina Fuss's literature on this. There's a lot of ways to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Some are well developed, some are really imaginary. Imaginary, that's not fair. They are still exist in the imaginations of their developers. And if we look at the amount that we can get from all of these methods, there's no silver bullet. There's nothing in there that's the clear winner. We're going to need most of them to reach 10 billion tons, and we're going to need all of them to get to 20 billion tons. There's nothing there that is a magic solution. We're going to need them all. And I call this the Big Tent. The climate requires us to let everybody in the Big Tent. We have to like everything that's available. We're going to need everything, and then we're going to need some more. So I'm going to finish with the wonkiest slide that I have, because this is the MIT Club. I can do that, right?
Yes.
These are the graphs from the very latest material that's come out from the IPCC that says, how many emissions can we tolerate in order to hit a certain temperature limit? And it's not really a rate, it's a total amount of CO2. And in blue, you'll see the amount that we could tolerate to still hit roughly 1.5 degrees, average of 1.5 degrees, maximum 1.9, between 1 and 1.9 degrees C. It's not very much. This is what you'll see in the news as the limit, oh my God, we only have 11 years to stop global warming. Well, that's not true. We have 11 years to comfortably hit 1.5 degrees. And guess what? It's not going to happen. Next set you see are the set that I think is achievable, 2 to 2.5 degrees C. They have a little more time to do the things that I'm talking about, time to get these negative emissions technologies up and running, time to get all those solar panels built. And that's going to allow us to hit a temperature that I think we can live with. But most importantly, we can still continue to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in the future and claw our way back to the 1.5 degree future that we would like to have. But it's not free. All that CO2 we've emitted is going to come back to haunt us if we reduce the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's going to come out of the ocean. And so the amount that we can reverse is actually only about 80% of if we could do it on the first pass. But the most important answer from this, and what the IPCC is really heralding today, is that every ton matters. Every ton we emit makes it worse. Every ton we remove makes it better. There's no bright line. Every ton matters. That's my bottom line from this talk. We should do everything we can, and the technologies and the approaches that we need to clean up the atmosphere exist. We can do it. We know how to do it. It's not too expensive. We have the technology. We have the money. It's time to just do it. Thank you.
Excellent, Roger. That was just a fabulous tour de force of where we are, and represents so much work on the part of you and your team at Livermore, and sharing it with us has just been very enlightening, very refreshing.
Thank you.
We have a number of questions that came in before, during the registration period, and I'm looking at them, and you've answered most of them in the talk.
Well, because I had them.
Well, cheating's okay, right? Yeah. Let me, and we got 15 questions now coming from the audience live. So let me go through some of these. From the ones that were submitted earlier, what would be the most effective incentive program or programs?
I like things that are highly targeted. I have a friend who worked in the policy community for a long time, and he tells me that the best policies are like shingles on your roof. They overlap. They're small. They do their job well. You don't try to cover the whole roof in one sheet of plastic. And so I like that approach. And there's a couple things that we need to do. First of all, we need to pay people to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The California Low Carbon Fuel Standard is one of the very first things that does that. Basically says, if you emit carbon dioxide from your car, we'll pay someone to remove that carbon dioxide later, and we'll basically tax your gasoline in order to do that. Those kinds of policies make a lot of sense, but they're not economy-wide. They're very targeted. And by the way, that number today is about 15 cents a gallon on your California gasoline.
Yeah. So I think you touched on this, but maybe a short answer. How big is the commercial aspect of negative emissions technology right now? It's not very big, is it?
Today,
Yeah.
Enormous amount of investment going into it. I would say that investment is approaching billion-dollar levels this year. The commercial aspect of it, actual sales, almost nothing.
Yeah. How will this factor into international markets and international agreements?
That's an interesting debate because, of course, a few countries are responsible for almost all the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. Us, China, Europe, Russia, interestingly enough, if you believe their numbers, that's a question.
Russia, yeah, of course.
And only a few companies are responsible for those emissions, if you basically count the fossil fuel companies as the source of the emissions. So a lot of people look at, should we target those things? And then there's the whole fairness thing. And this is why it's a difficult debate. You're going to have, border taxes associated with carbon pricing, and it's going to get complicated. It's going to be the State Department's hair-pulling topic of the century.
Yeah, George Shultz's proposal. I'm sure you're familiar with that.
Fill me in.
Yeah, that's the border tax, and it goes back as dividends to citizens.
Yes, and I actually am not fond of that because you're not spending the money to accomplish what you want to do. It's one of the reasons I really like the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which taxes fossil fuels and directly delivers that money in the form of these carbon prices that I was talking about to the innovators that are developing the innovative new products. The government doesn't even touch the money. Right. And it's a market system. If you have more innovation, you have more supply come online, then the price goes down. And in fact, the price this year has gone down. Right. That's innovation at work. And so I like those kinds of things. If you have these things where money is being transferred to people, which is what our industrial carbon capture, our cap and trade system in California does, there the money goes back to the state, and the state gets to play with it, and they get to have other programs, and they get to buy people flashlights. I don't know what to do with it. I'm kidding. But the point is, when somebody else gets a hold of the money, then you have a different life, and you're no longer solving that problem. You're now just redistributing money.
Yeah. How about discontinuing your screen sharing, unless you have?
Oh, sorry, I thought
No, that's fine. So another question, there are actually a couple of them here, and I'll combine them. Most of the solutions that are listed are land-based. What about, are there any things of sufficient scale that could be done in the ocean? For example, kelp.
We are just starting to look at those. There's starting to be a serious, thoughtful process by people who care about the ocean. The ocean is a difficult place because we all know that trash in the ocean is a bad idea and CO2 is trash. But there are people who recognize that the ocean is 70% of the planet, and it needs to be part of the solution as well as part of the problem. So there's a new organization called Ocean Visions that this year has brought together the NGOs, the scientists, and are really saying, what things make sense. But really up until this point, there's not been much serious thought about how to use the oceans in a responsible way. Mm-hmm. Kelp is one of those. It's another form of biomass. Get enough of it, it'll help.
Right. So here's a real short question to help some of the audience. Is biogas the same as wood gas or syngas?
No. Typically, when we talk about biogas, we're talking about something that comes from an anaerobic digester where it actually comes out as methane.
Right.
Wood gas or syngas or town gas, which they used to use in England quite a bit, which is why you could stick your head in your stove and kill yourself in England, was composed of methane, carbon monoxide, and carbon dioxide. They stopped doing that for obvious reasons, but that's what wood gas is. Now, the good news about that is you can turn it into anything you want. And so most of, like hydrogen, you can turn that into hydrogen, separate it into hydrogen and carbon dioxide, convert all the carbon monoxide into carbon dioxide. And that's, in fact, the basis of most of what I talked about.
If you had one magic wand that you could wave to move the field forward, what would that be? What would your one magic wand wish be?
I think a recognition that working with nature is the most important thing, and these biomass-based solutions are the things that are going to come online the fastest. Everybody, loves magical solutions of, let's plant a trillion trees. Well, we don't have space for that. So I think we have to be pragmatic, but these win-win solutions are the things that I would like to enable with my magic wand.
Yeah. Questions are coming in fast. Let me hold on a second.
Thank you all. Appreciate the questions. We'll try to get as many of them as we can.
Yeah. Let's see. Are there opportunities for supporting this work through philanthropy and corporates and individuals? How does somebody contribute to supporting this work?
One of the things about negative emissions is that there aren't big government programs to do this. They're just starting now. But the California report that I described was entirely supported by philanthropy. They said, government's not doing it. We want to know the answer. The state needs the answer. They paid for it. And there's a lot of work going into that, particularly in developing new kinds of negative emissions technologies. There's a guy named Grantham in England who's giving away his entire fortune, billion-dollar level fortune, to develop negative emissions technologies. So there's a lot of room for that. And the challenge here for venture capital is that you can't make money doing this unless someone pays you to do it. It's not like you don't have a ready market like you would have with electricity. And so for now, developing these investments, much of that that is coming from philanthropy, not people are expecting to get the money back again.
Yeah. So maybe some higher level questions here. How confident are you that we will not hit positive feedbacks in the climate before we turn it around?
I'm not. That's an unknown.
It's an unknown. Yeah. Okay.
I can tell you the further we go, the more chance there is we'll hit them.
Yeah. Well, it's like an onion. You peel back one layer and you find out what the next level of complexity is. Yeah. So here's someone who says he thinks that it can be a little confusing is how the scale is defined with respect to zero. The technologies that pull CO2 out of the atmosphere are clearly negative, but it seemed like when you were calculating negative emissions from not burning biomass, I presume he's referencing the minus 20 kilograms. It seems like that implies the current burning of biomass is part of the zero. Can you clarify? Does that make sense?
I think so. So if you went to a wood burning electricity plant in California, of which there are 12, they still exist, we call those net zero. They're not really, they're actually a little bit positive, but we call those net zero because they return the carbon to the atmosphere. In order to be net negative, you actually have to grab that carbon and permanently keep it out of the atmosphere. So that's the distinction that I hope to make when I talk about those things. Does that help?
I hope so. Yeah. Which companies are working on BECCS solutions here in California?
There are probably a dozen companies that are building plants or want to build plants up and down the Central Valley. Nobody's building yet. The closest, there's a company called Clean Energy Systems that's been in this for a while. They're in Modesto, and they have a contract for agricultural waste. And they started off, they were going to be a hydrogen company because of the analysis that we did. Hydrogen looks so good. They had done their own analysis. They weren't using ours. They have gone through the process of applying for a permit to put an injection well under their facility to store the CO2. And that's now with the EPA. So they're a long way down the process and hope to start in a year or two. The interesting thing about them is that halfway through they switched from hydrogen and now they're making electricity, because it turns out you can do a book and claim where you can sell electricity to electric chargers and get credit for the low carbon fuel standard, which is more profitable than making hydrogen. So there's all kinds of business to be done here.
Is storage outside of our atmosphere a possibility?
Probably not. just takes too much energy to get outside of our atmosphere.
It probably does, doesn't it? Yeah, yeah. And what are your thoughts about geoengineering to buy us time? Do you think we should be doing that, or what do you?
Um,
The price seems to be very low.
There's a lot of unknowns with that. I looked at that pretty carefully maybe 10 years ago, and one of the challenges is that it's hard to know whether it's working. The geophysical constraints on understanding the process are extraordinarily complex. Just to, the three guys that just got the Nobel Prize for all the complexity of that system, it's like, yeah, it's hard. And the second thing that concerns me about geoengineering is that the minute you turn it off, you return to exactly where you would have been. There's no accumulated benefit. You have to keep doing it or you lose everything.
Well, it seems like it buys time.
It might. And the question is, how do we want to invest to buy that time? I think we're still in shape to buy time with other methods, but I also think that we should understand how geoengineering would work in case we need it. It's what I said, we need everything and then we need some more. I have to tell you though, that the sky would be always gray.
Yeah.
And that, just personally, I would rather that wasn't the case.
Yeah, me too. It would seem like it would be a little depressing.
Yeah.
To have less sunlight. You can tell when the fires were so bad recently, we had this orange tint in the sky and you just felt it affected you emotionally. I'm with you on that. Given that CCS has been around for decades, what do you see as the major inhibitor?
Fat cats at fossil fuel companies that want to keep doing exactly what they've always done. We saw this happen to the coal industry. They simply didn't want to change. They wanted to talk about clean coal, but they didn't do anything. So, I think that some of the fossil fuel companies are coming around and working hard on this, but they're going to have to work even harder. The problem is the ball's in their court. They can either do it or they can go out of business, and we'll see. I'm betting that most of them will go out of business and a few will change their business structure. And, we still need the same services. I work a lot with the French company Total. I think they're doing a very good job and they're getting out of the petroleum business. They want to go to entirely natural gas for now, but in the long run, they own most of the gas stations in Africa. And they understand that they're going to still be selling services from those gas stations, and they want to sell services that are carbon neutral. And that's their goal, to be carbon zero by 2050.
So we've got a couple of investment questions here.
You take those, Larry.
Yeah, well, maybe. No, it's a good way to lose money, as a venture investor, not as a real investor. Who does good work in the field on the corporate front? And related to that is, if you had $1 million to invest in a negative emissions technology company, which one would it be? Those are sort of related questions. Who's doing the best work? And Arthur Lee, who's our Chevron buddy, is in the audience, and he's saying Clean Energy Systems and Chevron and Microsoft and Schlumberger. So who's doing the best work, and where would you put the money if you were going to make an investment?
Well, I think I couldn't tell you. I would be investing in these things that relate to the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, because there's a regulatory system in place to pay for the negative emissions, which is not true anywhere else. So, you're basically looking at things that make liquid fuels or that enter the transportation market and reduce the carbon intensity of those things. So the technologies that get there, or, the plants that do that job.
Yeah. Directly in the plants.
Well, those facilities, those biomass conversion facilities that could make hydrogen, they could make aviation fuel, they can make diesel. At the scale that we costed them each one of those is a $1 billion investment, and we need 50 of them.
Yeah, yeah, it's not small change. Yeah. So that leads sort of into this next question. To what extent do you expect politicians to solve our problems versus scientists who make it economically advantageous to use lower carbon sources of energy? For example, if fusion suddenly becomes practical, producing clean energy at lower cost, how does that impact the predictions? I'm not sure I understand that question. I think what the question is asking is once we have the science and the technology and the understanding to use lower carbon sources of energy, to what extent are we going to see the politicians involved?
I think we've got ample evidence that politics is a difficult place to get good science done.
For sure, yeah.
But I am very, very optimistic about corporate obligations, because when a company companies have enormous resources, they can spend money to achieve their goals. And when they say we're going to get net zero, they now going to have a bunch of noisy shareholders in their annual meeting every time going, how are you doing? Why are you not on your goal? How are you going to get there? And there's going to be a lot of pressure to succeed, for those corporations to succeed. And they have the investment money, they have the knowledge. The American industry is incredibly adept at coming up with new things. So I'm actually much more confident about that. And I think that we'll eventually arrive at a political consensus. But I'm afraid it would be a little depressing that we're going to arrive at that political consensus after we lose a Gulf city. One of these Category 5 hurricanes is going to come on and just erase a city from the Gulf. The good news is we're good at evacuating cities today. It's probably not going to kill thousands of people, but that's the kind of thing it's going to take for this country to wake up. And I'm not eager to have that happen.
Yeah, nor would I. How many times have we rebuilt, New Orleans, right?
Yeah.
What is the carbon removal pathway with the most misunderstood upside potential?
Upside potential.
You have to think of that sort of two ways.
I'm not going to harp on the biomass again, because I've already talked about that. There is a lot of upside potential in soil. Yeah. And there are a lot of charlatans selling soil credits today. And so the upside is for people who do it right and can account for it properly and are selling things that are durable, basically that are going to last for a long time. But the amount of carbon we can put into soil is unimaginably huge. And so I think a lot of upside there. Got to get it right.
Yeah, your slide said 487 gigatons, I think, right? That we've lost, since the Industrial Revolution started. Yeah, so that would be a real opportunity. Yeah. So I think we've been through most of these questions. Let me ask one more. What words of advice do you have to those starting out in the field, or for those interested in working for DOE or for Lawrence Livermore Lab?
Well, first of all, I think this is an exciting field. This is the problem of our generation, and not my generation, a young generation, and it's not going to be solved in the next 20 years. We'll be lucky if it's solved in the next 50 years. So there's going to be an enormous amount of really interesting stuff to do. My first piece of advice is to get really good at one piece of science. There's a lot of people who want to approach this as a policy problem or some kind of a social problem. That's important, but we need good science. We need the technology to be right. We need the things to work. But then once you're good at it, then expand, understand social, understand environmental justice, understand geography, understand the fact that land use is going to be a bigger constraint than cost. So, let your envelope expand. Don't be stuck in just the differential equations.
Land use being a bigger expense than cost, you're sort of implying that solar is going to be difficult because it's so land intensive. Yeah, right.
We've run the numbers on California getting its electricity system to zero carbon by 2035. And one option is all renewable.
Yeah.
And that option would cover 30% of the Central Valley with solar panels. Not because you need all that electricity, but because you need so much extra electricity for the times when it's not working.
Yeah, right. Okay. Roger, this has just been absolutely fabulous. I have learned so much, and I'm sure the audience has as well. And I want to thank you again. You know, I first saw you talk at Stanford 2.5 years ago, and that was just a fabulous talk then. And then you came and talked to a couple of other groups and gave us some real inspiration. And this has been well, it's been inspirational. And thank you so much. I appreciate it so much, and the club does as well. Let me turn it back over to Doug.
Let me second that. Inspirational is a great word for what you were telling us, Roger. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I've learned a tremendous amount, and excited about this being the very first of several events where we focus on various kinds of negative emissions and how we can make a really major difference using that technology. So, or those technologies, I should say. So thank you for laying that all out. And let me tell you how much we appreciate all of that. And both of you guys, great presentation, great Q&A. Larry, thank you so much for moderating tonight. Not to mention getting Roger to do this and everything. Roger, thank you for all of your candor and your insights. They've been fantastic. And it just gives me some good feeling that, hey, it may not be over yet. We may be able to work this out and to save ourselves from catastrophe out there in the future. Okay, so I wish, you know, we usually give our speakers a bottle of California Cabernet, but that's not going to happen tonight, and you may not even be able to accept it, so that's okay. I do want to say what our next event's going to be. It's going to be on December 2nd, and Arthur Lee, who is a senior researcher at Chevron Corporation and who is the advisor to the corporation for climate change, is going to lead a discussion of an analysis of the COP26 meeting, which is going to be held in the first 2 weeks of November, and really help us understand what's coming next in the fight against climate change. We've had a series of these COP meetings, in the most recent big one being in Paris, and so on, but there's still a lot of work left to be done to secure commitments and to get better clarity about where are we really going with temperature changes and abilities to impact this whole process. So really looking forward to having Arthur lead that conversation. And with that, I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. And I hope you enjoyed this presentation and hope we see you again the next time we do this. So have a great evening and a good weekend later on. So long.
Thank you very much.